Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about wages, or actually to talk about unpaid wages, because this is now becoming a problem not just in the private sector, but also in the state sector, which is the first indication that Russia is genuinely running short of cash flow. It's been reported that some workers in Russia are going months without pay, and wage arrears have quadrupled over the past 12 months because companies simply don't have the cash to be able to make those payments. And as I mentioned, even state linked enterprises are defaulting on wages. And this situation is spreading across every major region in Russia. And this is a clear sign that Russian companies are now running short of liquidity. So, why do companies not pay wages? Well, the simple answer to that is because they don't have enough cash to be able to do so. And not paying wages is basically an interest free line of credit. It's a way of borrowing money. You're essentially not paying for something that you've had the service for. So it's the same as a company not paying its suppliers. Now, obviously, when you don't pay your supplier could stop supplying you with all of your essential raw materials. And it's the same for wages. If you don't pay your people, then at some point they may walk out of the door. But as this is now spreading across Russia, it's not that easy to just walk out of one job into another because you may find that you're encountering the same situation, especially if you're talking about certain industries which are being most affected. So, which industries are suffering the most in Russia at the moment? Well, the construction sector is the worst, and around 44% of wages are reported as not being paid. Mining and extractions, approximately 17 to 18% of wages in that sector have gone unpaid. Manufacturing and industrial plants, it's reported that between 11 and 12% of wages have not been paid. And problems are also growing in transport and logistics. And in the public sector, some teachers, doctors, and utility workers are also reporting that they've had delays on their payments. And even professional sports clubs have missed wage payments. So this is right across the board. We're not talking about one specific sector. We've got lots of different parts of the Russian economy that are now being impacted. Now, just before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, investing.com. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I've been working with investing.com for some time. And their AI, their artificial intelligence, is amazing because it gives you the ability to pick out stocks that it believes will beat the markets. And I've been following those AI picks for the last few months, and they've been doing really well against what the market has been doing. Now, currently, the markets are in a state of turmoil. Nobody really knows whether they're going to go up or whether they're going to go down. And this is the perfect time to make sure that you've got, firstly, a huge database of information at your fingertips, which is what investing.com offers to all of its subscribers, but also the use of artificial intelligence. And one of the great features that investing.com offers to its subscribers is the ability to analyze stocks. So if we have a look at Tesla, I've done some analysis here. You can just at the click of a button press analyze chart, and AI will go through this stock and it will give you all of its thoughts and ideas as to what it thinks is going on with the price, what the risks are, and what potentially could happen. And the amazing news is that investing.com are offering a special deal to subscribers whereby you can get 55% off their usual price. And in addition to that, Joe Blogs viewers can get an additional 15% discount. So this is an amazing deal, but it won't be around for long. So if you're interested, either scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. So what about the numbers involved here? Well, the official figure for unpaid wages currently is around 2 billion rubles, which equates to around 25 million US dollars. And that's affecting around 10,000 workers. However, that's only the large enterprises. And press reports state that the actual figure could be 4 or 5 times greater than that. And 75% of all of these arrears have been built up in 2025. So that tells us that things have got worse this year. And this is the fastest growing wage deficit that we've seen in Russia for more than 10 years. So this isn't a recurring problem. This is specific to this year. Now, as we discussed, construction is the worst hit of all of the industries, and around half of all wage arrears in Russia are currently sitting in that sector. And this affects even major state projects who are failing to pay contractors. So the Kremlin isn't making its payments, it's not paying its contractors. And obviously, if the contracting firm doesn't get the cash, then it can't pay all of its people. But metro lines, highways, and university campuses have also experienced delays, and workers are reported to be walking off site due to unpaid wages. Subcontractors are collapsing under unpaid invoices. And what this tells us is that the switch to the wartime economy is running out of steam because the money isn't reaching the bottom of the chain. In the mining sector, hundreds of workers have now been laid off, so they've been fired, and they haven't been paid their salaries. Factories are cutting back on their shifts and putting workers onto unpaid furlough. Orders are down sharply across heavy industry, and companies are now drowning in debt with no access to credit. So that's why they're now using this form of credit by basically not paying the workers that they owe money to. And some plants are reported to have not paid their people for 4 months now. So that's a serious problem, because I think you can probably live with going 1 month without your salary. But when you're talking about 4 months, so a third of a whole year, that becomes a real problem. And hidden unemployment is rising fast in Russia because this is essentially a way of masking unemployment. If companies aren't paying their workers rather than laying them off, it's not showing in the official unemployment figures, but essentially you've got people who are still not getting paid any money. And there are some really interesting reports about the defense sector, which you would have thought would have been sacrosanct. They would have made sure that all of the defense companies were being paid, but that isn't happening. And key factories serving the Navy and National Guard have been reported as not paying salaries. A single strategic plant in Russia is reported to owe 300 million rubles in unpaid wages. Workers are reporting 3 months' delay in getting paid in the defense sector. Mass layoffs are underway, but final salaries have not been paid. And this collapsing cash flow is directly linked to the state not paying out on their contracts and shows that the war economy is starting to crack. So why is this happening right now? Well, there are a number of different factors. Firstly, lots of companies in Russia have high levels of debt. And if you've been following the channel, you'll know that interest costs at the moment are around about 20%. The base level is 16.5, but banks will add a profit margin on top of that. And companies are prioritizing the payment of those interest payments rather than paying their people because they're worried that the banks would take action and close the company down. In addition to that, we've also got rising cost of imports, so all raw material costs are going up at the same time as producer prices, so the end product price, are going down. We've talked about that in recent videos, that producer prices are now in negative territory. So Russian companies are selling their products for less today than they were this time 12 months ago. So that's cut all of their profit margins. The cost of taking on loans to pay the staff salaries is prohibitively high, so companies don't want to add further to their debt burden. And many companies are also seeing delays in their payments of what they're due from either the state or their customers because the state is holding back on payments and customers don't have the cash. So we've got multiple factors that are feeding into these cash flow problems for companies. And rather than firing all of their staff, they're just deciding not to pay them. But at some point, the human cost of this is going to start weighing down on the Russian economy. Because if you're an individual and you're not being paid your salary, then what are you going to do? Because you've got to pay your debt. So if you've got a mortgage, you need to keep paying those mortgage payments. If you've got credit card debts or you've borrowed to buy a car or go on holiday, all of those sorts of things, you need money to be able to make those payments. Otherwise, the banks are going to come after you in the same way as they go after those companies. So what we are seeing is that Russian individuals are either having to use up their savings, which nobody really wants to do, or borrow more money to keep making all of their payments until they actually get paid their salary. So what we are seeing here is an explosion of debt companies and individuals are taking on more debt right now. And that debt is highly expensive because interest rates are so high as a result of the fact that Russia has been experiencing high levels of inflation over the past 3 or 4 years. So, this is all starting to build up into a nightmare scenario for companies and individuals and ultimately the Russian economy. So, what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking about all of the different factors that have been impacting on the Russian economy. And obviously, the sanctions were the starting point. But since the sanctions have been in place, they've actually got more and more aggressive in terms of what the impact is on Russia's ability to keep trading. And recently, the USA actually sanctioned the two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. And that was the first time that we've seen those companies coming under the microscope. But what we are seeing is the long term impact of these sanctions and also Russia's switch to becoming a wartime economy, which seemed like a smart move back in 2023 when the Kremlin started to pay lots of companies directly to support the war effort in Ukraine. Those companies were thriving, they were being paid directly by the Kremlin, and so they had guaranteed revenue. They started hiring as many people as they could to fill all of the seats, to maximize their output and receive the maximum amount of payments. And that unfortunately affected the whole of the jobs market because we saw wages rising in Russia. So lots of companies have experienced an increase in costs over the last few years because we've seen wages going up, we've seen raw material prices going up as a result of the sanctions. It's now more difficult for Russia to be able to source all of the raw materials and other imports that they need as part of their production processes. And we've also seen a loss of international markets for all of those Russian companies. So it's been a nightmare situation for a lot of businesses. And what we are seeing in 2025 is the chickens coming home to roost because the companies are now running out of cash. Now, one of the reasons for that is because the Kremlin, the state, is delaying the payments to all of these companies because they don't really have much negotiating power. If your sole customer is the Kremlin, and you're making lots of things to go for the war in Ukraine, and the Kremlin suddenly says, "Oh, actually, we can't make your payment until next month, or we're extending our credit terms to from 30 days to 60 days to 90 days." What are you going to do? You basically can't do anything because you've got all of your eggs in one basket. You've got a sole customer, and if that customer decides that it wants to delay your payment, then there's nothing you can do about it, particularly if it's the Russian state. You can't take action against the state. You can't start bankruptcy proceedings or threaten to send the bailiffs round or anything like that because I don't think President Putin would take very kindly to those sort of discussions. So we've got a lot of companies in Russia right now that are dependent on state payments. Those state payments are being delayed. And as a result of that, there is a knock on impact because if those companies have subcontracted any of their work, then they're not paying any of their contractors. Those contracting businesses who operate lots of different things and have lots of different staff, therefore don't get any cash, so they can't pay their people. So we've got this waterfall effect that when the people at the top stop paying, it hurts everybody. And this isn't a short lived phenomenon. The reports coming out of Russia state that wages have been unpaid for 3 or 4 months in many of these sectors. Now, that is becoming a serious problem because you could get by for a month or so, probably on your savings. You might borrow a little bit on credit cards, and it'd be a short term impact. And you could just basically say, oh, well, that's just the way things are. Sometimes you just have to get on with it. But when it becomes 3 or 4 months, you start thinking, am I ever going to get paid? Is my job at risk here? Am I going to be made redundant? And if so, how am I going to pay back all of these loans that I've had to take on to pay my mortgage and to put food on the table and do all of the things that I usually want to do? So we are seeing a really big problem starting to build in Russia at the moment. These unpaid wages are not reported officially in any of the statistics. So they're not unemployment. So people are not actually being laid off. So we're not seeing a spike in unemployment, which would raise concerns if it suddenly started rising rapidly. And we're not seeing anything in terms of companies defaulting because they can't make their interest payments on their loans, because what they're doing is rather than paying their people, they're using the cash to pay the banks to make sure that the loans are still okay. But obviously, you've got other people on the end of that who don't have any money, who are having to borrow money. So the debt is still growing for all of these companies and individuals. They still owe that money. It's just the workers don't have as much power to actually do anything about it. So it looks like an easy form of credit. But obviously, from a goodwill point of view, you're burning all of that with your people, because if you don't pay people, you're losing loyalty. You probably don't want to carry on working for a company if it's failed to pay you for 3 or 4 months in a row. You would be looking for a new job. Now, that could be challenging in Russia right now, because if there's lots of companies in the same sector, such as construction that we talked about today, we've got possibly 40% of construction companies are not paying their salaries on time, then you don't really want to move to another construction company and find that you're in the same boat. So, what we've got here is a fundamental problem that's growing within Russia as a result of a problem with cash flow. And this cash flow problem comes from the fact that the Russian state is spending more than it's earning. So it's now having to think of ways to cut back on that cash, all those payments. And so not paying people is one way of doing that, but it's a short lived way of getting around the problem. And it causes problems further down the road because people lose confidence and faith. And so less companies would be interested in taking on those Kremlin contracts if there's a risk that they're not going to get paid. And also, once you're fully exposed to the state, then basically you might as well be state owned, because there's nothing you can do about it if the Kremlin decides it's not going to pay you for 3 or 4 months. And the bottom line here for the Russian economy is obviously really bad news, because we're seeing an increase in debt. Debt is currently really expensive in Russia. It's going to have to be repaid at some point. That's going to suck cash flow out of both companies and individuals, so they'll have less money to spend. And this is coming at a time when the Russian economy is already slowing down. We're seeing GDP every single quarter, the growth is slowing down. It's heading towards a contraction. So it's likely that we'll see Russia going into recession at some point over the next 6 to 12 months. And things like these hidden debt payments for unpaid wages basically make things worse, because it's just building up more and more debt. So the bottom line for today's video is that the Russian economy is struggling right now. And the hidden unpaid wage arrears that are building up in Russia are bad news for Russian companies, Russian people, and ultimately the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative, and hopefully thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up, and please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much if you're one of the people who's supporting me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, or signed up as a patron or a YouTube member or buy me a coffee member, thank you so much. Really appreciate that support. Helps to keep me going, and here's something to put a smile on your face.